First of all, it's already been noted, there probably aren't very many economists in the room. In fact, is Neville here? I haven't seen. There you are. You slipped in on me. I didn't see you. Neville's the one. Neville Spear contacted me several months ago about participating in this program, and he's figured out how to exploit one of my biggest weaknesses, and that is if you ask me early enough, I'll agree to anything. I'd probably sign my own death warrant 6 months out, you know. And I say that not to say that I'm not happy to be here. I'm delighted to be here and have a chance to participate. But as this thing approached, it became very apparent to me that I had a lot of work to do to try to get a handle on this. And I am out of my element, certainly from with respect to the science and the science, technicalities that I am not trained for in that respect. So it's been an interesting process. It's been a very educational process for me to put some of this information together and take a look at it. I do want to acknowledge at this point many of the other speakers in the room. We had a conference call a while back. They've been very, very helpful in directing me to literature that I had not sourced at that point, providing me with things that helps, and I'm not sure I'm going to do justice to all of that. I don't have as much detail in here perhaps as I would like. I found it challenging, to say the least, to try to summarize all this, but I am glad to be here and have a chance to share a little bit with you and maybe put a perspective on this. I'm pretty sure that the best I can hope for really is to maybe frame some of the questions rather than provide a lot of answers in terms of some of this stuff, but hopefully provide some perspective. So, getting into that, I have a few slides here at the beginning just to kind of make sure we're all sort of on the same page in terms of where we're at in this industry, in terms of animal numbers, kind of what direction we're heading. Some of these things are just basic background information. Some of them, I think, probably have some implications for some of the things we're talking about. So you can see the cattle inventory. Obviously, we've been focused a lot here in the last year or two on the fact that we finally have turned around, started rebuilding this herd after a long period of liquidation with a brief interruption in the middle that really was about 20 years of liquidation with a very brief attempt at expansion about a decade ago. And again, that has implications. It changes the demographics of our herd a little bit when we're in expansion. We haven't been in that in a long time, and it has certainly some market impacts, but it also may have some implications with respect to some of the management issues. If you look at the beef cow herd, the pattern is similar. The chart looks very similar. Again, really highlights the fact that for much of the 19 years prior to 2014, we were in liquidation mode, and with almost no result of an attempted expansion halfway through that process about. And so, and again, you can put this in a historical perspective in terms of what the longer term trends have been since the mid 70s in terms of the all-time peak in numbers and so on. On the dairy side, again, going back to the mid 50s or so, you see a pretty dramatic change. We're not going to talk a lot about the dairy stuff as has been indicated, but you can certainly see the last 20 years or so have been fairly steady after after declining for 30 years or so prior to that, and then sharply declining prior to that, really going all the way back to probably World War II. Somewhere in there was probably the peak. I didn't look at it exactly. So you kind of see where we're at on numbers there. If you look at feeder cattle supplies, this is a calculated number that we do from the inventory reports every year, principally on January, and now only on January 1. And, again, you see the same general pattern there in terms of how, obviously decreasing cow numbers has led to smaller calf crops, smaller feeder supplies. That's beginning to turn around really significantly, showing up this year in terms of the January 1 estimate, showing the first significant increase in feeder supplies in quite a long time. And that's in contrast to this next one. If you look at feedlot inventories over time, and this is only once a year, we get an inventory estimate, at least a subset of the total every month in the monthly cattle on feed reports. But on January 1, if you plot this over time, there's an interesting contrast here in terms of, feeder cattle supplies have declined pretty continuously for 30 years or so, for the most part, and yet cattle on feed numbers followed a different trend. And I think that may be important in terms of some of our considerations for this particular disease at the feedlot. It clearly indicates that we're doing things differently now than we did back then. Okay, we're feeding animals. We've got different age demographics in the herd. We've got different management going on at the feedlot level. And so, these not only give you a historical perspective kind of on where we've been, but I think do have some implications for some of the economic impacts. So if you look at where we are now, January 1 of this year, just under 92 million head of cattle in the country, and put together a pie chart to show just in terms of the absolute inventory numbers kind of how it breaks down. And this again is important. It's already been pointed out that BVD affects across the industry, virtually all sectors, in different ways to some extent. So about a third of our total cattle population in this country is beef cows. Dairy cows represent 10% of the total number. The feeder supply, again, that's a calculated number from the inventory reports. This is made up of all of those steers over 500 pounds, the calves under 500 pounds, and non-replacement heifers, the other heifers that are not already in a feedlot. Okay, so we break out that feeder supply number from the cattle on feed numbers, which are 14% or so, and you can see bulls and the replacement heifers and so on make up the rest of that. And so, again, that's the numbers we're working with, and then these are the numbers I'm going to use to put some values on some of this. So, again, BVD impacts all sectors of the industry in different ways. In terms of, and I think this plays a lot into not only measuring the impacts, but really getting into thoughts about what it's going to take to implement a control program of some kind. I'm an economist, and economists probably first and foremost look at incentives. We always say follow the money, but following the money means you look at what people have motivations to do economically in most cases. There's other motivations occasionally that matter in some parts of things, but generally it comes down to recognizing what those motivations, what those incentives are, and how people will respond to those in order to evaluate sort of what outcomes we can expect, and then we can think about whether or not we want to try to modify that in any way, perhaps to get to a different outcome. So again, this is just summarizing what you've already heard this morning. And I think, the key thing at the cow-calf sector, really the beef sector specifically, all of these components of BVD impacts, whether it's delayed or decreased conception rates, the aborted fetuses, we might recognize those. I mean, depending on whether or not we find them or whatever, and when they occur. Increased calf mortality we might see, but an awful lot of the lost or the impact here is probably not even recognized by producers. And that's an important point. You're not going to control something if you don't recognize it. And again, we've had some discussion of that already. And certainly, on the face of it, if you're not looking for it, you won't know about those persistently infected calves, and at least the ones that survive. And if you're not looking, the ones that die, you won't know that's what the problem was. So, I think that's going to play into a lot of our discussion here. These are the numbers, again, aggregate average calf crop in the U.S. Okay, now this is beef and dairy cows added together, the total calf crop as a percent of that. It appears to have declined some over time. I don't have an explanation for that, and certainly don't have anything to specifically or set of things even to attribute it to. But one of the things that's apparent is that some of these BVD impacts are embedded in this calving percentage. Okay, and again, part of the problem of recognizing it is that we're sort of used to seeing this. I mean, these are the numbers we see. Individual farms, of course, have their own numbers, operations, but these are sort of the baseline, and we don't recognize some of the losses that are occurring, some of the impacts that are occurring, simply because we're just not used to seeing them. They're part of these measures. If you make some assumptions, which economists occasionally do, about the dairy, we don't get the breakdown, but if you make some assumptions about the dairy calf crop, then you can estimate the beef calf crop, which looks pretty similar. And one of the implications here is on the beef side that the decline is there, and that's based on the assumption, the explicit assumption that I made in doing this, that the dairy calf crop percentage has not changed over time. And I don't know that to be true. I don't have data to really address that. But I think it's less likely that we've seen change there. And so, again, I'm not suggesting what's causing the decline that we've seen up until recently or what causes it to be variable over time. But, the question in terms of this context is sort of, if you could take out those BVD impacts, how much would this change? I don't know that we know the answer to that, but it's there. It's embedded in this, and recognizing that and trying to get a handle on that is going to be an important part of it. On the dairy side, you've got all of those same, primarily reproductive as well as productivity losses from a cow herd standpoint, whether it's a beef or dairy cow herd. Essentially the same set of impacts with the additional direct impact in terms of milk production, decreased milk production, decreased quality in some cases, as well as the tendency for this disease to set up through immunosuppression, the possibility of other health issues as well that show up directly, again, at the dairy level. So you've sort of got the whole package of reproductive and production impacts, both direct and indirect. At the stocker feedlot level, again, I'm not going to separate those because I think, the implication of all of this and from all of the studies and stuff that I looked at, those PI calves that survive to post-weaning level become somebody else's problem. And that's a big part of the challenge going forward. Many of those calves will not survive either the stocker or backgrounding phase, or if they do that, they very likely will not survive the feedlot phase. And so you've got those cattle with the tendency for increased morbidity and mortality. And more importantly, the fact that those PI calves are exposing all of the animals they come in contact with, both directly in terms of feedlot situation, not just the pen in which those animals are, but any fence line contact or pen contact. And so, one of the challenges in trying to estimate economic impacts is it's not just how many PI calves or what the incidence rate is, but also the way they're distributed. In a particular feedlot, if all of the PI calves were in one pen, you'd have a real problem in that pen, but potentially you could manage that much better and minimize the impacts than if you had one in every pen where you're going to be exposing a much higher percentage of the total feedlot. And so, there's lots of challenges there, and it certainly affects the kind of impact that you're going to see as a result of that. Again, part of the challenge of attributing an impact specifically to BVD is the fact that it's so closely linked to other disease issues, such a contributor to the BRD problems, and part of that overall measures of again at the feedlot level, but and perhaps even more so at the stocker level. Okay, if you think about the incidence of PI calves or the ones that survive, there's going to be more of them at the stocker backgrounding level. Some of them will not survive. There'll be a slightly smaller set of them. So arguably the biggest impact is at the stocker or backgrounding level. We don't have very good data on that in general. But the way the sort of epidemiology works, you would expect that to be the case. We do have more measures typically at the feedlot level of some of these things. This is the Kansas Focus on Feedlots survey data that's been around for quite a long time now. I took the monthly reported death loss out of that set of data, calculated a 12-month moving average. There is some seasonal tendency, so you can get past some of that seasonal noise, if you will, to focus on trends here. and sort of see that. And again, an implication that this has increased over time. I'm not suggesting a reason for that. I'm sure it's complex with a number of contributing factors, but perhaps more importantly, again, from the standpoint of BVD, is that whatever's going on there is built into this number. And so, the challenge here is to try to recognize or find a way to break that out. This is some data from a particular unnamed commercial feedlot over a long period of time, actually going back to the early 80s. The line with the yellow squares on it is the average across all weight groups. This is looking at them by initial body weight, and you see the same tendency. Basically, death loss has increased over time in feedlots, and again, that probably raises a whole set of questions and a whole other conference on what all's going on there. Certainly, that's not the point today. But again, so we're trying to isolate sort of one piece of that and get a handle on it. This is also some commercial feedlot data, and this is a little complicated, but if you can follow that, the line at the bottom, I guess I have a pointer here. This line at the bottom is and this is by in weight groups again. For something over 200 pens of cattle, actually from last year, that's the average percent sick head days for those weight groups. Okay, and the dots on this chart represent the sick head day percentage for each individual pen. Again, there's a little bit over 200 pens in this set of data, and so you see, obviously most of them, and you would hope the majority of them, are concentrated down at the low levels. And in fact, if you take those dots and put them in this form, it's the same data in table form, again by weight group, and at the bottom the total across all of these pens. If you look at the sick head day percentage across all weight groups, you've got about 88% of the pens where the sick head day percentage is 2% or less. Okay, and I'm not sure what the target is here, but it's probably something like that. Okay, so you're achieving the majority of that. Probably what's important from the standpoint of the real impact, and I suspect that you would link a lot of that impact to BVD, is not here, maybe not even here in terms of something a little over 2%. It's probably out here in these ones that are over 3%. Okay, so if you go back to this chart, the real challenge or the real problem up here is probably these pens up here where you've got very high sick head day percentages. And we pulled a few of those out of this data set to kind of illustrate that point. These are the 5 worst lots out of that 200 and something set of pens of cattle. The 5 worst lots, in no particular order, because it would depend on how you define things, but the bottom line is they're all bad. Sick head day percentages that range from over 5.5% to over 7.5%. And associated with those death losses, that the lowest one is over 7%, the highest one is 37%. It doesn't take very many of those kind of pens to get large economic impacts, and I think it illustrates one of the other challenges of getting a handle on the economic impacts here, and that is that, average measures probably mask the problem and mask the challenge to some extent. Whether we're talking incidence rates or these kind of measures, it may not be the average that's the problem. It's finding and isolating that relatively small set of really horrible problems, and all of the indications are again that BVD plays a big role. And not all of this can be is likely due to BVD, but it very likely. And these were not tested. I don't have any data to know whether or not what role BVD played in these particular pens. But everything we know about it, you would have to suspect that very likely that's the problem. So again, from the challenge of trying to get a handle on the impacts and the distribution of those impacts, it really illustrates the issue. So, you know, to get to some numbers, and this is really kind of playing short shrift with a lot of literature that I looked at. There are a number of estimates out there. A number of people in this room have done studies that have contributed things. Dr. Grooms reviewed a couple of those in his talk as well. Again, from the standpoint of trying to summarize all that, it's very difficult, frankly. You know, there's lots of different ways to sort of state these impacts. They're based on different populations, different assumptions about epidemiology or the clinical assumptions and the economic assumptions, as well as just different methodologies. There are some simulation studies that have done specifically tried to do the economic simulations, incorporating physical assumptions. In other cases, it's been more of a case study kind of an approach, and so on. Having done all that, having looked at it, scratched my head a lot, scribbled a lot of notes trying to figure out how to organize all that, you know, I think these numbers probably capture most of those reports and probably do capture, in a general sense, the impacts across the industry. I see people writing these down, and that scares me a little bit. You know, I'm not going to defend these numbers very far in one sense because, again, there's a lot of things going on. But, you know, everything I can see would suggest that for all the beef cows, that 33% of all the cattle, you know, there's probably something in the range of $20 to $30 a head impact across the industry. For the dairy side, it's a bigger number. Not sure how big, but, you know, something on this range. I put 45 to 55. The toughest one probably is the stock or feedlot sector. You can find studies that have really big numbers, but then, you know, it's usually not across the whole population. It's, you know, either a specific, again, case study, or it's on the exposed population, which is different than the total population, so on. So I hedge with a really wide range, and this may not even capture it, frankly. Okay, but $20 to $45 per feeder animal. And I decided that was a way to look at it. Rather than try to break out cattle on feed numbers and the others, I just used the feeder supply that we calculate, which in that earlier pie chart was about 28% of all the animals. They're all going to go through the feedlot, at least the ones that live are. And so I figure if you apply it at that level, you're getting close. When you multiply all that out with the current inventory of cattle, you know, you get a range of estimates anywhere from $1.5 billion to $2.5 billion of impact. I've seen estimates that were actually bigger than that. There's some reported estimates that go as high as $3 billion for the industry, and it could well be. I think the important point here, first of all, is that it's a big number. Okay, it's an important number, and to an economist, that's not a trivial assumption. In that, if you're going to talk about managing it, we'll get to it in just a second, controlling it. You know, you have to have assurance that it's a problem that warrants control, and more importantly, control to what level in terms of the economic decisions. If you take that that range of estimates for the industry total, divide it back by the total cattle population in the U.S. So every cow, feeder animal, feedlot animal, calf, and so on, you get $17 to $28 a head in this estimate. Okay. And again, I suspect that's ballpark, and it kind of tells us, you know, sort of where you start with in terms of values to work with when you start thinking about control. Who will do it? At what levels will we do it? How much can we afford to spend doing it? And so on. Did I do that? For once I didn't, I don't think. It's okay, I need a drink anyway. Yes? I think, particularly in that example, for example, so what we spend on preventative measures, probably those could be added on to this in many cases. I'm thinking about, again, all of the studies I've reviewed, all of the analysis I've done. Most of this is direct losses, basically. And again, you know, particularly at the feedlot level, when you start trying to break out BVD separate from the broader respiratory complex and so on, it gets really challenging. But I think you're probably right. If anything, this is probably not looking at some of the, you know, there's probably some additional expenditures in terms of things that we may be doing that in terms of those kind of costs, for sure. So, any other questions at this point? Having said that, how do we tackle this thing? Okay, it's a big number. We can agree that it's a number that warrants some effort. We don't need to dwell on that, but I do like that little guy. He's got my respect. Let's put it that way. So, you know, let's think about the challenges. And again, from here on, I want to try to think about, again, from a system standpoint, from an economic standpoint, trying to get a handle on who's got what motivation to do things? Where does that lie? And so on. And so, you know, what are the challenges as I see them at this point? And this may not be a comprehensive list. Again, I think a big part of it for many producers is a failure to recognize the disease. You know, and again, the point was made earlier, here or in other countries, if you're not looking for it, you're not going to find it. It won't be obvious in most cases, except in the occasional severe outbreak or something. And so, you know, again, incidence rates, we know are low, or at least we're pretty sure they're low in most cases, and then that depends on exactly what population you're talking about, but across the board, incidence rates are fairly low. That's probably masking the issue in many cases, because my guess is that with the distribution of the disease within that average is what's really important in terms of trying to get a handle on it. And again, it's built into our production benchmarks. So, you know, it's hard to recognize how many calves you're losing that show up as that lower calving percentage, because, you know, we're just not used to seeing what you don't have. You know, you don't know what you don't know in this case. And so that's a challenge, I think. And certainly that's going to be one of the obstacles then to any sort of control program, is to get past that and really get a handle on what we have and what it does to us, okay? Do we have it? And then recognizing the cost. Again, you don't know what you don't know. So we're losing from both reproductive standpoint as well as lost production at all levels, but cow-calf level all the way through to the feedlot level. You know, broadly speaking, there's not a lot of incentives at the cow-calf level to identify and remove these PI calves. Okay? Now, you can take that a couple different ways. I'm not suggesting that people are unscrupulous on the face of it, but incentives matter, and so you know, sometimes it's convenient to not know, right? Again, I'm not suggesting that as an industry that we would deliberately bypass that. I think in the first case it's more a case of just not knowing legitimately, and those problems become somebody else's problems. But you have to recognize, you know, that if you do know, you got to fall on the sword and take the hit on those calves versus the possibility of sending them on down the road to somebody else. And again, it just is what it is. Okay, incentives matter, and I've heard lots of stories. You guys have all heard them too. You know, you go back in time a little bit to TB testing or bangs testing. What was the solution for some people some of the time? Was to just sell them as quickly as you could. You know, again, incentives matter. And that gets to, you know, obviously sets up the idea, then what do you have to do to change that incentive so that you know, particularly at the cow-calf level, you have an incentive to find and remove those animals, and that's clearly the level where you need to be doing it. So, you know, that sets up the contrast between the source and the incidence of the impact. And that's one of the things that makes it hard to to implement control, but also to think about the economic incentive for control when you have that distinction between the source and the incident of the impact. We heard something about the testing. Obviously, testing costs money. Testing has not been perfect. It's a technological advance, and it's getting better all the time from what I can tell, and probably going to get cheaper over time. And that's all to the good. So, those things are probably working in our favor. The nature of the disease is obviously a big challenge, okay? Dr. Grooms made the statement that the virulent, the mucosal calves die, and that's probably a good thing. And the biggest problem we have with these others is that they don't die sooner rather than later. If they did, we wouldn't be having these problems. And then, of course, the many variations of the disease affects vaccine effectiveness. And again, that's technology that's changing constantly with the polyvalent vaccines, and all of that other stuff sets up the likelihood that those things are going to become more effective, and so on. And then, of course, again, this role of BVD into a broader set of health issues. So, economists look at marginal costs and marginal benefits. If there's one principle in economics, it's that decisions are made at the margin. And we do stuff, whether it's positive things, we do them until the additional value is equal by the cost of getting it, or whether we're managing costs. We manage cost at the margin. And that's the basis you want to start with to understand the economics of BVD control. You can think of it at the animal level, and again, low incidence rates. There's not very many of them, but when you have them, they're pretty severe problems. Really, it doesn't make a lot of sense to focus on the animal level because of the nature of the disease and the nature of the exposure that comes from PI calves. You really got to think at a management level. So it's not the number of animals that's infected that's important, persistently infected in a herd. It's the fact that there's one in the herd. And so it's the herds that become important. Or at the feedlot, it's the pens. And really, it's the whole feedlot, depending literally on the physical configuration of a feedlot, the extent to which one PI calf in one pen affects not only that pen exposes, but all contiguous pens potentially as well. Again, I've already talked about averages versus the distribution. And then, from the standpoint of what is our objective, the question of eradication, I think, is a very important question. And really maybe a good question that I don't propose an answer to, but the notion of eradication from first and foremost from an economic standpoint says we're probably going to go past the point of marginal cost versus marginal benefits, certainly from the standpoint of the individual producer. And so that sets up the idea of where are we going to focus our efforts, how are we going to organize those efforts, at what level, and so on. There's reasons to do that. Obviously, we've got a number of other diseases where we've tried to do that for, epidemiological reasons, public health reasons in some cases when we're talking zoonotic diseases. But again, in terms of economic considerations, depending on what your objective is, that's going to have a big impact. So, benefits, well, everything we hear, everything we've heard so far, everything that I've read said that, the calves start at the cow herd level. We really need to find them as quickly as possible and get rid of them at that level. Okay, the stocker feedlot problems really go away if you control it. I mean, they don't totally go away. You still have to do some things, but they largely take care of themselves if you can get the control at the primary source. Okay, clearly the challenge. For producers, you can reduce some costs and see increased production and/or, markets provide some incentives, and I'll talk about that just a little bit more a little bit later here to wrap this up pretty quickly. Because of the low incidence, there's a number of published studies out there that would suggest, and given the cost of testing, at least what it has been in the past, that, it wasn't a clear-cut economic answer that you should go out and test everything all the time. Okay, that marginal economic decision-making becomes very important in terms of how much control. We often don't think about that, but most things come down to not whether we should do it, but when do we stop? And again, decisions or the nature of the objectives that we set for ourselves will impact that. Same thing on vaccinations. Again, from a purely economic standpoint, as they become more available and more effective, then you increase the economic benefit of using those, and so you see that the technology is moving us the right way with respect to both testing and the vaccinations, the vaccines. And that should make it easier to do some of the things we're trying to do as we go forward. This has already been mentioned, but I'll just highlight it again. The important point being that you've got to do more than one thing. Education plays a big role, it appears to me, because, again, there's so much lack of recognition of the problem, recognition of the impact that it's having. So just basic awareness of the disease and, more importantly, the impacts of that disease. Having the records which might help to identify those hotspots, if you will, or concentrations. Now, again, it's been pointed out that from the average incidence rate, you would have to test an awful lot of animals to pick up a 10% increase in incidence of the disease. So it's not necessarily going to be easy in a broad sense to identify those, but to the extent that producers have the records to know what their own benchmarks really are, it will be easier for them to identify changes in that would be indicative of a problem, potentially. Testing, again, there's very much questions about doing that on a broad-based level, at least, again, up to this point. I think that might be changing. But certainly, given the objective of trying to identify those animals as soon as possible and get them out of the herd, that's the need versus the cost, and that's the challenge. Vaccines, we've already talked about. And, if you go for eradication and get there someday, then things change, at least with respect to this disease. But clearly, in the short run, if you do testing and you do vaccinations, and then you don't do biosecurity, it's kind of like in Oklahoma. If you cut down the cedar trees and don't do anything else, in 10 or 15 years, you got lots more cedar trees. Okay. And the fires we're having right now are taking care of some of them probably, but it's an ongoing thing. And so, making progress, unless you get to a point where, you actually eradicate it or something, means that all of these components are very, very important in terms of the long-run economic impact of doing these things. So what's next? Well, again, it depends in part on the objectives. I'm not suggesting what they should be. I think it's going to matter whether or not your objective is eradication versus control, and particularly whether your objective is to sort of let economics dictate the level of control versus maybe a level of control that goes beyond what we can get to. The solutions, one question that I would start with most of the time is can the market solve this problem? Okay, that's usually where we start with, and all else being equal, we'd like to see the market take care of this. It hasn't, and this is not a new disease. It's been around a long time. We haven't necessarily made a lot of progress, and for all the reasons we've talked about, I think. The benefits and costs are distributed across different sectors in such a way that it's difficult for the market and the market players, the economic actors in this thing, to internalize all of the costs as well as all of the benefits. And so, obviously, again, recognizing that the cow-calf sector is largely the source of the PI calves that cause so many problems down the line, to the extent that there are market-based incentives, and you can state them as premiums for testing to not have it, or at some point, if everybody's doing it, it'll be a discount for not testing. Whichever way it is, it amounts to the same thing in terms of an incentive. That can help. That can help move those benefits back to the level where people can make decisions. Again, there is some, certainly some indication that exists out there now. There are some economic incentives. There also are some indications that it's probably not enough yet to really move the needle a great deal in terms of the level of control. Again, there's too many possibilities here for sort of out of sight, out of mind, or maybe not even aware that it is in sight and it's out of mind. So, if you move to the industry level, we've already heard some talk about an industry initiative. Certainly there's some the benefits are there in total at the industry level. How do you capture that? I don't know. Certainly there's some things you can do to improve coordination, the education, other things. Partly why we're all here, right? Is there and I just throw this out, is there a possibility for some sort of industry-funded mechanism? I don't know. I don't even know what that would look like for sure. It's easy to write the words. I don't have any details, but it could be done that level, okay, potentially, where there's some sort of industry-funded initiative that's managed at the industry level to, again, depending on what the objectives are, in terms of control and so on, control versus eradication. And then a public sector role, again, depending on the objective, depending on a number of things, it may be easier to have comprehensive programs when you take it to the public sector level. Is there a recognition for supporting it at that level, at whatever level we want to try to get to? Obviously there's some benefits here in doing things in a coordinated manner, and it could be done at the industry level. It could be done at the public sector level in terms of controlling. BVD is a little like a weed control district, right? If you control all the weeds and your neighbor doesn't, you got a weed problem on a continuous basis, and you're going to spend money to fight it continuously. If you can wipe it out on a regional basis, whatever size region we want to talk about here, then you capture the benefits to the industry and ultimately then to everyone in the industry much better. So there's questions there about what level there is of public value as a disease, and certainly, again, given its epidemiological characteristics, there's a lot to be said for thinking about it at more than just the market level. It's very difficult to capture all of the impacts of this disease at the market level. But what support is there for a public investment in controlling this disease? Doesn't have a zoonotic component like some of the other diseases. We clearly have done that for. That doesn't mean that it isn't worthy of consideration at that level. So lots of issues, lots of questions. I don't have answers. I've had a lot of fun learning how to ask the questions, at least ask some of these questions.